Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Factual Faith podcast. In this episode, I have my good friend from high school, Micah Beardsley, hop on the show to discuss his new book, Kindred of the Unseen. Now, Micah and I reconnected recently as he announced the release of his book, mostly over the fact that he and I are both creating content in the Christian sphere. So we had a lot to exchange and chat about recently. And as I have reconnected with Micah, I realized that we had a lot of similar stories to exchange and a lot of interesting wisdom to offer one another. And I thought to myself, I had to get him on an episode of the show. So this month, we're talking about everything associated with his book, what led him to writing this book, and the heart and the mind and the spirit and what he hopes to deliver to the world by writing this book and releasing it. We have a really interesting conversation about Christian content creation, the risks and the joys, and the ultimate goal behind essentially what we do when we put pen to paper or when we hit record on the microphone. So I hope you enjoy. Let's kick it off. Micah Beardsley, thanks for joining me, mate.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's been a good, how long since we spoke to each other since high school? It's been a good 11 years or something.
Sounds about right.
Yep. And neither of us have grown up since.
Not entirely.
No.
Not entirely. Just a little more of this happening.
Yeah, exactly. We're both going to be playing with our facial hair for the entirety. I feel sorry for the people watching.
They get to enjoy the show.
Yeah, good. All right. So, Micah, I wanted to get you on the show to discuss your book, The Kindred of the Unseen. Now, I figure the best way to get this episode going is for you to tell me what are all the events from as early as you can remember and as personal as you're comfortable with getting. What are all of the events that led you to say, I want to write a book about, and we'll go over what the book is about after, I think.
Sure. It's a funny question, actually, because it wasn't anything spectacular that happened. There wasn't any great event or any great revelation where I went, this is what I'm meant to do, this is what I have to do. It was just an afternoon out in the garage, I think, that I can remember thinking, more than anything else, I thought to myself, I want to do something with my life that I'll enjoy doing. And I enjoy a good story. I love weaving stories. I love, more than anything, watching stories as opposed to reading them. But it was something similar to that. It was just, I want to do something that I can really sink my teeth into and something I can really enjoy doing. And so it was partnered with the idea of writing a story, but writing it for the purpose of glorifying God more than anything else. Writing what I felt He wanted me to write, and trying to tell a story that weaves in spiritual concepts and spiritual realities into a novel, basically.
And so I guess for those who are curious about your book, how would you describe the base premise of the book itself in the novel perspective, and maybe also what you want to achieve out of the book?
Trying to summarize it's always a challenge.
Yeah.
The base premise, I think, is about a bunch of characters. There's 4 different storylines that this first book follows, and the base premise is about just people awakening to the idea that there is more to life than just what they can see or what they can hear, what they can feel with their hands. There are realms and realities of spirit that are beyond the 5 senses, basically. And awakening not only to discover those, but to discover their individual purpose within those realms and their identity. But it's essentially trying to do a reflection of us, of what it is in real life when we walk in a walk of faith. When we walk as Christians, we walk as more than just people on the earth. We know that there's a greater destiny to who we are as sons of God, as the children of God. and our journey is in discovering that and discovering who we are and who He is, and more of who He is, more of His love, more of His greatness, and what we are to do, what His will is for us,
Mm-hmm.
and how we are to move on the earth. So it's in a lot of ways, it's what I've tried to do is reflect that in this book, trying to reflect what it is that we walk through in the lives of these characters.
Yeah, there's there's a fair few authors that I can think of
Mm.
that have kind of have tackled this in the past. Namely, the biggest one being like C.S. Lewis, for example,
Yep.
who has done something similar. And if you have a look at some of the other bigger stories like Lord of the Rings and a few others, there's at least a bunch of biblical and spiritual themes that kind of make
Yeah.
you think a little bit more of, hey, there's like a that we always talk about the tangibility of logic and the
Mm.
tangibility of thought and reality. But we never, a lot of the time, we never really try to come to terms with the fact that there's a bigger, more concerning elephant in the room, which is the intangibility of logic and the
Yeah.
intangibility of reality.
Mm.
I always like to think back to people like John Lennox and C.S. Lewis and
Mm.
a couple of other big authors and advocates for the faith who they constantly talk about. We can talk about all of the scientific rules and the material rules for this earth,
Mm.
but then we also have this higher rule sitting behind us going, well, how do we even know that we can determine or agree with any of that to begin with? And so
Yep.
and then you have things like the ontological argument, which is a whole other step of mess that speaks to that even more. And
Mm.
I remember my journey coming to terms with the spiritual and the unseen all started with Hebrews 11 verse 1, which
Yep.
paraphrasing it a bit
Mm-hmm.
is it pretty much states that faith is the evidence of things unseen, right?
That's right. Yep. That's
and
right.
and so and
Yep.
that we actually have an evidence based faith behind believing in the things that are unseen, right? And
Yeah.
so
Yep.
I think when you really come to terms with the unseen, the Bible actually opens up so much more,
Oh,
right?
big time.
Yeah,
Layers upon layers
yeah,
upon layers of truth in every scripture,
yeah.
that just delve into the whole depths of stuff. It's incredible.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that sort of opened up in my head was actually talking about the 5 loaves and the 2 fish,
Mm.
where we've got a situation where the disciples are like, "What do we do? How do we possibly even feed all of these people?" And Jesus
Yep.
goes, "You do it."
Exactly right.
He goes, "You."
Exactly right.
He says, "You do it," and then
Yep.
um, and then you're kind of stuck in this position where Jesus is kind of going, "Hey, like I've given you the keys to realize, like
Mm.
there's actually an unseen, a spiritual element here to solve this problem. You
Yep.
know, the God that we serve has promised that this is how He operates. It's
Mm.
up to you to just take the keys, like
Just do it.
yeah,
To just do it. Yeah.
yeah. And so I remember when you first told me about the book, because I think we caught up the moment you kind of released it. I was like, I gotta
Mm.
catch up with Micah.
Yeah.
And yeah, I thought it was really timely, at least for me, because I was totally coming out the other end of like this really, deep period where I was totally rethinking my faith, and I
Mm.
was like, wow, we're totally missing the beat in this day and age of,
Oh yeah.
the spiritual world. They're not even close, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny because the supernatural is present right throughout the Bible. It's not
Yes.
like you're reaching for something that's, oh, it's sort
Yeah.
of a guesswork, or maybe that's what it means. It's pretty evident
Yeah.
that it's there,
Yeah.
and not even just with Jesus. Like
Mhm.
like what you were just saying with the disciples there. I was just following up on Philip in the book of Acts, where he was literally teleported from one spot
Yeah.
to another. It's right there.
Yeah.
It's in Scripture.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, if you go really far back to some of the old prophecies of the Old
Mm.
Testament,
Yep.
man, there were some huge claims that,
Yep.
there were some huge claims that God had made over people. He's saying to
Mm.
some people, all right, cook your food over poop. And you know, and we've got
I'm sort of glad I haven't had that call just
yeah,
yet.
we've got our prophets of old who are like, oh, look, I'll do it, but can I at least make it cow manure? And he's like, oh, all
Mm,
right, you know.
that's the compromise. That's
Yeah,
the middle ground.
exactly. Um, so it's we're we're only in terms of what God is asking of us in this day and age.
Mm.
It almost feels like we're just cadets in comparison
Oh,
to the to the
please,
sergeants and the generals that came before us,
please.
right?
I mean, Hebrews again, where it talks about what is it, the is it the first fruits?
Mm,
Things like raising the dead,
yeah, yeah,
casting out demons,
yeah.
cleansing lepers. I can speak for myself. I don't think I've done any of that. So I think cadet is the right word for
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
Just starting.
exactly. Yeah, there's it's pretty telling, when Jesus has to speak to the disciples and the townsfolk about
Mm,
the demon that they couldn't cast out, and he said this one only comes out with prayer and fasting,
yep.
and he calls them a faithless generation because of it. And you're like, oh dear.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. So I guess this sort of I think this sort of plays into it a bit as well because there is a part of this that's really hard for us to swallow, right? It's
Mm,
understandable that it's
mm,
really difficult for us to swallow this pill.
mm.
And I'm wondering, is that why you went to opt for a novel rather than to simply just say, hey, this is how the faith works. This is how, read this.
Yes.
This is what it says in the Bible. Is that kind of your motivation to opt for the novel so it's a bit of an easier pill to swallow?
Absolutely right. Yep. That was one of a couple of reasons why I chose a novel more than anything else. I found that I love fantasy because of the way you can explore spiritual or supernatural stuff in a perhaps a more relatable, a more accessible environment, for want of a better word. Because obviously there's things like dragons, sorcery, magic, all sorts of things like that you can really delve into, which is kind of fun to look at, even from a biblical point of view. But it does sort of open up room for you to explore spiritual stuff in a way that I can't quite find the right word for it, but it's sort of like in a way that's more relatable, in a way you can, if you weren't a believer, you might be able to connect with it more easily. You look at something like Lord of the Rings and you look at the subtle little nuances that Tolkien put in there and the references. There are some that are more obvious than others, but the references he put in and the way he paralleled his story with supernatural principles and with spiritual ideas.
Mm,
And that is a widely beloved story.
yeah.
I think more than just believers, it really resonate with that story and love it. And it's coming through even through things like the Marvel universe. Everything that they're doing supernaturally, people are awakening to the idea of supernatural principles.
Mm,
That they want it, they love it, they go after it, and I think God's in all of that.
yeah.
And so it was a way just of trying to paint a similar picture in a way that people could more easily grab hold of it, maybe
Mm,
more willingly grab hold of it if there are, you know, certain people that are maybe not churchgoers.
mm.
They might look at it and more easily take a hold of it and accept it in that sort of environment.
Yeah. Yeah, there's it really is a balancing act because, there's some people who um they love the idea of just being told in a very right angle way, hey, this is how
Mm.
the world works. And
Yeah,
like I definitely fall more into that category of someone who,
yeah,
if you make a statement and you say this is what, this is how something works, this is how life works, this is how you bake a cake or what have
mm.
you, I'm going to look at that statement and I'm immediately going to go, are they correct? Are they not correct? I think they're
Yeah.
correct. I believe, like
Well,
I have
prove it.
this
If you're going
far
to make
more,
that statement,
yeah.
yeah,
So and then on the other hand, you've got people who are far more, sort of, they have like maybe a higher EQ. They're far more
mm.
willing to sort of feel something out for themselves and
Yep,
see how their emotions react to it first before they really take like a more clinical yes or no approach to something. And I think that when you come at it from the novel perspective, you really do have the opportunity to kind of nail both sides of the coin in a way, right? Because
Yeah.
you can be a little more on the nose, but then you can also be a little more winsome in terms of the writing and the beauty of the novel. And yeah,
Yeah.
so I think it's always going to be a timeless method of communicating a serious idea.
I completely agree. I
Mm.
couldn't agree more. And I think I'm more lean toward the feel, how I feel about something side of the coin. But I definitely see what you're saying, and I think the other side of why I chose to do it in a novel format was for my own benefit, because it was a way for me to push the limitations of my own imagination in a lot of ways, for me to step beyond what I already believe, open myself up to God's word and to hearing His heart, and exploring the possibility of even more of what could be. A lot of the process of writing this book was done with God,
Mm.
and it was sitting with Him saying, "What do you want me to write next?"
Mm.
And there were times when I would write something, and I could feel it in my spirit. That's wrong. That's not what you want to write. It was what I wanted to write, but it wasn't necessarily the direction God wanted me to go in.
Yeah.
And I could sit for a few days without getting an answer on it. But as soon as I did, it was like just a revelatory moment of, wow, that's so much better
Mm.
than what I ever thought of writing. And it did it. It took me to certain places where I didn't think that was a reality. I didn't think this particular idea or this particular notion was a real thing. But of course, I don't know everything. I've barely scratched the surface, like you're saying. And so it was not only was it a fun way of exploring perhaps deeper principles, but it was a way of pushing the boundaries
Yeah.
and exploring a greater understanding of what could possibly be a truer reality, a
Yeah.
higher reality.
Yeah. Yeah. There's I'm about, I'd say close to about a quarter of the way through the book at the moment.
Yep.
And I even found that while I was reading it, especially as you were describing the realms,
Mm.
I found that there was this. It was almost like I was able to envision it
Yeah.
brilliantly. You've got a real gift for descriptive writing. You've
Thank you.
nailed that aspect of the book.
Thank you.
Because I was envisioning in my head perfectly as you were talking about it, and
Mm.
I think even as I was reading it, there was a bunch of revelations that I was getting in the moment where I was like,
Mm.
oh, I've not thought about it like that. I don't even know if Micah intended it for it to, if Micah
Nice.
intended it for it to reach me that way. But there was
Yeah.
still like revelation that I was getting out of the book.
Mm.
And yeah, and there's definitely a notable power that comes out of something when it's fueled by God, right? It's fueled by
Mm.
the Spirit. You
Yeah.
you can tell there's like a power that comes out of like a sermon that's fueled by the Holy
Yes.
Spirit rather than a
Absolutely.
sermon that's just got a human agenda behind it.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, and in saying that, now that I've given you a bit of feedback, the if you were to kind of drum up in your head, um, what would I really hope someone would come up to me and say after reading the book? Like what would be the purpose that you hope this book is going to achieve? You have someone, they've read the book end to end,
Mm.
and your like fulfillment from this project is they come up to you and they say, Micah, I bam kind of thing.
Yep. Funnily enough, exactly what you just said a
Oh,
minute ago,
terrific. Okay.
because there's that's sort of the goal. Of course, I want the book to be successful, sure,
Yep.
but a big part of why I wanted to write it was to do exactly what you just said. There was to try and open minds to perhaps a different way of seeing things, a different way of thinking. Uh, it's it's not the first time someone's come and said, "Wow, that's you may not even intended to do that,
Yeah,
but this
yeah,
is what
right.
happened."
Yeah,
And I go,
awesome.
"Yeah, yeah, yeah, exactly,"
Yeah.
because, like I said, some of this has been written with God, and so my intent behind what I've written may be different to what he was communicating through it. But that's the end goal, is just for not that I would ever profess myself to be some great profound teacher.
Mm,
Believe me, I barely know anything.
mm.
But that's what I hope to do, is to, like what I was saying about myself, is to just push the limits of the imagination and try and open minds, try and paint a picture of what could be, and
Yeah.
hopefully in that process of reading, people enjoy the book. Hopefully, but hopefully they also see maybe that is true, or maybe I had that experience. I know what he's talking about in that regard. I felt the same way. I felt the same thing.
Yeah, there's you and I have sort of had this conversation a little bit
Mm.
beforehand, and it's this idea, especially because you and I are both now kind of Christian content creators in some way, shape, or form,
Yeah.
and we're both new to it. We both started
Mm.
this year. We're both kind of only getting our stuff off the ground this year,
Yep. Yep.
and I kind of experienced something similar recently. The previous episode, so last month's episode,
Mm.
I I had a couple of people lined up to record with, and it just kind of fell through.
Oh.
And I felt like I had this sense from God saying, start writing an episode where it's just you talking. Don't
Yeah.
don't have someone else. It's just you. And I was like, okay, sure. I have a few ideas. I'll just start. So I have this huge kind of notes file thing that I have going on. Do you know Obsidian, the program Obsidian?
No.
Oh,
No.
it's
No.
like a
No.
massive notes organizing program. It's brilliant. I love it.
Sounds like what I need. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really good. And so I have this massive notes thing going where it's just like all of my ideas and all of my reviews of certain things are just I document them all in there.
Mm.
And there was like this 9-minute video from a atheistic commentator named Alex O'Connor. I don't know if you've heard of the guy. He's on
I
YouTube.
haven't.
Okay.
No. Okay. Yep.
Yeah, he's quite famous. He's a little bit younger than us. I think he's in his mid-20s, and
Sure.
he's quite famous for being a popular atheistic thinker.
Mm.
And he's quite brilliant. I really respect the guy because he's got a really good head on his shoulders, and whenever he
Yeah.
thinks about something, he thinks very deeply. And he just
Mm.
has this like 9-minute opening statement as to why he doesn't trust the Bible. And so I went through
Okay.
and I watched through it, and I was like, man, this video is really, really convincing
Mm.
if you're not really well versed in your Christian literature. Like
Yep.
it's very convincing. And so I felt like
Mm.
God just kind of tapped on my shoulder and said, hey, like, give this a go. And so I went through. It took me like at least a full week or two of covering this 9-minute video and doing all the appropriate research and summing
Mm.
everything up. And I was like,
Yep.
man, what am I doing? This feels so like niche. It feels almost like something only I would enjoy in the entirety of this world. Like,
Sure.
because I love this sort of thing, but I was like, man, nobody else is going to enjoy it.
Yep.
And then it was like my most popular episode by like 10 times the normal amount or something. And I was
Yep.
like, what is even going on here? There's no way
Yeah.
someone enjoyed me just rambling about like how I pick apart videos and stuff. And it's funny because I got a whole bunch. All of the comments on the videos are like negative comments.
Oh, great.
From like atheists who are just like, no, you have no idea what you're talking about. This, that, whatever.
Mm.
All negative comments. But anyone who knew me went like, I had people that I know and people who I hadn't even maybe spoken to in a while go out of their way to like message me personally and say, hey, this video was like amazing.
Yeah.
It totally revolutionized the way that I like think about other perspectives and how to break down other perspectives. And I was like, wow, this is more than I could have ever asked for, that it's like changed. I had like 6 or 7 friends and a bunch of family members come up to me and say, hey, this is like amazing. Like, this is a really
Fantastic.
good episode.
Yeah.
And it was, that was like, oh yeah, that was really worth it.
But that's the thing, right? Is when you do what you think is a good thing, sure, it could work out, but it's all the better when you follow God's call on it.
Yeah, exactly. It like I could have done whatever episode I had planned, and it probably
Yep.
could have done pretty well. But
Yeah.
this is just one of those moments where I feel like God was saying, "Hey, like I actually think you're ready to put your own thoughts out there,
Yeah.
instead of just talking to people all the time." Oh yeah, all right, I'll give it a go.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's really quite a fulfilling thing, even when it's just like one or two people come up to you and say, "Hey, like I actually genuinely really enjoyed
Mm.
what you put your soul into just then."
It makes a big difference, eh? When it's
Yeah,
something personal and something you've worked hard for.
yeah,
It
exactly.
really, you remember that. You remember that stuff.
Speaking of which, you said you've been planning this for like 7 years now or something.
It's been a long time. It's been a long time, and I think that's part of it is because the journey it was a journey with
Yeah,
God. It was a while of nutting everything out,
yeah,
not only from a logistic point of view of nailing down your characters and your plot lines, all of that, but it was the descriptive element. A lot of it was sitting back and imagining and putting myself in the position of the character
mm,
and imagining myself in that realm, in that space. What would I be feeling? What would I be seeing? What would I be experiencing? How would that space affect me if I was in that place? And at least from a musical point of view, I can write from personal experience. Uh, there's a whole section. One of the four storylines is about a group of musicians that just travel from place to place, and that's been a part of my walk and my family as well in all of this journey. A lot of it has been music based, sound based, and so that one I could particularly write from a personal experience point of view. But it was sitting down and really working through what does God want me to say and what do I remember from that time and how did it affect me and how did what was the outcome of those actions and that activity and how can I then turn that into this novel? How can I turn it into the story?
yeah,
So it really was a process and a long process because I'm still working a reasonably full time job at the same time. So it was, go to work through the week, come home on the weekend, sit down, start nutting it out, back to work, and it was coming in and out of that space. I don't know if you feel the same way, but coming in and out of the creative space can be quite challenging sometimes when you're immersed in that space, and then you've got to step out of it and go back to work for
yeah,
for the week.
yeah.
That's quite
Well and
challenging.
truly, well and
Yeah,
truly.
yeah.
I think especially when you hit a roadblock, right?
Mm.
The
Oh,
roadblocks just make you want to go, oh man, why do I even bother? Like
yeah.
I remember because for me, one thing that is really, really important is I've always been a bit of like an audiophile. Like I love working with sound, and
Yep.
I've always done sound for my churches, and I spent a lot of time in it. It took me like 2 days to mix this microphone to make sure it was good for the podcast.
You know what you want.
Yeah.
Uh,
And there was a few people that I wanted to bring on the podcast, but they just didn't like they were either too old to work the technology or they just didn't want
mm.
to set it all up or didn't know how to work it all online. And I said to myself, I was like, oh man, how do I do all this without spending money I don't have anymore? Like I already
Yes.
spent a whole bunch of money getting this microphone and getting a bunch of other things set up in here, so it's all good.
Yep.
And I was down to my last bit of my budget for this podcast, and
Mm.
and I was just at this roadblock because I was like, how do I possibly get it? It's quite annoyingly difficult to get two microphones to record off one computer. You
Mm.
usually need an extra bit of hardware or to use certain software, and it's quite annoying to set up.
Yep.
And I just was like praying over it, and I was trying to work it out, and for ages. And then I
Hmm.
just read this one little like um, forum one day that was talking about like certain audio interfaces that allow you to pair with this program that I'm using to record
Mm.
with.
Yep.
And I had one of those from like 10 years ago
Mm.
lying in a cupboard.
Perfect.
And I was like, oh man. But the roadblock that of trying to figure it out was just, it was messing with me. I was like, oh man, this
Mm.
is taking so long. Like I'm trying to plan these episodes. I'm trying to release these episodes. I'm running out of time. I'm running out of like mental capacity to figure this out.
Yep.
But yeah, the roadblocks and stepping in and out of the creative space, and for me, the big thing is when I'm on like a train of thought, reviewing an idea or reviewing a video,
Mm.
and I have to stop and, like you said, go work like a week's worth of work, and then come back, and I'm like,
Yep.
what did all of these notes mean? Like,
Yep.
What like
Scrolling back
silly,
through the
yeah,
notes
what
page.
silly philosophical principle was I digging into at this bit? Like, who's this
It was so
philosopher? Yeah,
profound.
yeah, like who's this philosopher that I've randomly like written down in the middle here, and I've got some
Yep.
like funky notes that don't make any sense to me. Like a week later, and I know
Mm.
exactly what you mean. It's very like agonizing. So
But
when
I don't know
all of
about
that,
you.
yeah.
Sorry, you go. You
No, I was just
finish.
gonna say when all of that is like finally rewarded, it feels incredible.
Oh, it certainly does. Yeah. I don't know if it's the same with you, but there were a couple of instances where, in that process, in the creative process of, for me, writing the book, you can. I spiraled a couple of times in thinking about why is God not answering me? I've come to him with a question, trying to figure this thing out. I thought it was pretty simple. I thought I had it right the whole time. All of a sudden, it's wrong. Why? Why? Okay, so I'll sit and I'll pray. I'll sit in a quiet place and I'll contemplate and I'll pray about this. And why is he not answering me?
Yeah,
You know, I've been sitting
yeah,
here for a while now. I'm not getting anything.
yeah,
I'll go and I'll come back the next day. I'll do the same thing. And I actually had this process in coming up with the title of the book because, long story short, the initial title I had didn't quite sit right. When I first came up with it, even then, I knew it wasn't quite right, but I was, at the time, I couldn't be bothered thinking up with a
yeah,
different one. So I left it for a long, long time. Finally got around to getting the book published, and it came up again that this title wasn't correct. So I sat on it. I sat on it with God for, I think it was a good couple of weeks actually, before finally got the answer. And you're not wrong. The satisfaction you get when you finally get that answer, it's, oh my gosh,
yeah,
what a relief.
yeah,
Only to find out that the subtitle was wrong. So I had to go through and sit through the whole process again. Now that's not right.
yeah,
But it's part of the problem was I had this box. I had this mindset of this is the title that I wanted originally, and it's got to fit within those parameters. You know, maybe it's just one word that'll change within that parameter, and that'll be it. That'll be the change of the subtitle, and that'll be fine as well. But it was actually a process of you need to let go of what you're holding on to, step outside of the box, and that's where you'll find the actual answer you want. And that's how I came up with the subtitle as well. That's where that came from. Was a process of actually letting go of the thing I was holding on to, in order to take a hold of the better option,
yeah,
what God had.
yeah,
And
yeah,
again, the satisfaction that comes, finally,
yeah,
finally,
yeah,
after all
exactly
that
right.
time.
Yeah, it's definitely like a crazy relief and like a weight off your shoulders when you finally feel like you're like, oh man, I crossed that off my list. We're good now.
Yeah, got it.
Yeah,
We got there.
yeah,
After a month, we got there.
yeah. So, to flip the tone of the conversation a little bit and to get into
Mm,
something a little bit deeper and a little meatier, maybe.
mm,
Um, we were saying before how we feel like there is a kind of spiritual abandonment, a spiritual barrenness,
yep.
desolation in our society nowadays.
Mm,
I've heard it put really well by C.S. Lewis. I
yep.
forget exactly how he words it, but it's this idea that like, why would you ever need to involve God or the spirit in your matters when money
Mm.
can do everything for you? You know,
Oh, sure, sure.
and we live in this world where it's like, why would you ever hone the idea of being in a place of the spirit where you're, I don't know, cooking for people or something,
Mm,
when you can just shovel a bunch of money at something and leave it and that'll do all the work for you, or
yeah.
you know, you don't pray for healing and you don't
Mm,
rely on God for healing, like supernatural healing on something, because you're like, oh, I'll just do whatever the doctor tells me because now we have the facilities to do it. And you know,
yep.
that's not to remove any sort of goodness from these ideas. Obviously, you know, there's
Mm,
goodness in technological advancements. As
yeah.
someone who myself is heavily involved in the medical world, and my wife is a doctor as well,
Yep.
I am all for medical advancements and technological advancements in hospitals and everything. And you know,
Yep.
when man achieves something great and solves a problem, then absolutely let's embrace that. But
Mm,
um, there are moments where, like you said, casting out demons and healing the sick, and
mm,
maybe even resurrecting the dead, where you know there are things that humans can't do still.
Yes.
And so it's important for us to recognize that obviously it's not limited to things like healings as well. It could be
Hmm.
helping people pick where their career's going to be, or where they're going to move,
Yep.
or who they're going to marry, or if they're
Yep.
going to get married at all, or
Hmm.
what they should have for breakfast, even for some people, like
Sure.
there's, yeah, like
Sure. Yep.
the spirit leads you on all of these different journeys. And we do really live in a spiritually kind of depraved generation now, because we
Mm.
don't feel like we need it. We don't really. We've kind of
Mm.
convinced ourselves that we have everything we need to solve all of our problems, and to live to the fullest and the most joyful way possible.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd have to say I'm on the other side of that coin. I
Okay.
can't. I couldn't be without
Mm.
the spiritual stuff.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I just couldn't be without that.
Yeah.
Going through church, for example, in years gone by, years and years gone by. I haven't been in church for a while now.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say that I don't connect or don't have a fellowship of people that I gather with, but I can remember even as a young man, like teenage years, thinking to myself, it's not the most alluring thing to sit in a building in a pew, listen to a man talk for 45 minutes for an hour,
Mm-hmm.
and then go home.
Yeah.
That to me that I've been sure that might have been what church was back then, or it might have been what people called church. But it didn't appeal to me. What appealed more to me was the fellowship aspect, the family aspect, and as time went on and as I grew up, more of the spiritual stuff
Yeah.
in pursuing that. And again, it's all biblically present there. You're talking about healings and resurrection of the dead. Yeah, technology hasn't come to that place. If it ever will, mind you,
Yeah.
if it ever will.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And yet, that's all stuff you can achieve through spirituality. And even the idea of what the church is and what the church is supposed to be,
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a greater model than that image of just sitting and listening. That's perhaps a good form for teaching, but as to what the church is supposed to be, I think there's a greater picture to explore, and there's a greater gift in what Christ did for us on the cross than just being sinners saved by grace.
Yeah.
There's an exploration of he died so that we could become or be restored or be redeemed into what we were meant to be.
Yeah. Exactly right.
Which is sons acting in a spiritual capacity. So yeah, for me, I can't be without the spiritual side of things. I'm not sure. I think you'd be the same.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think once you walk through that door,
Mm,
um, there's no convincing you to walk back out, right?
yeah, yeah,
It's I don't think I at least I hope I don't think I could ever be convinced to walk back out of that door again.
no,
I would hope
exactly.
that door remains bolted shut behind me.
Hmm. Yep.
Because there's so many things that I look at in my life at the moment, and I know that they were huge spiritual occurrences, things that I said to myself, I was like, no, there's no way this is true, but
Yep.
I serve a omniscient God, so
Hmm.
let's test those waters,
Yeah.
and so many of those things came true, and I was like, wow, okay, yep, I can't ignore this anymore, like
That's right.
I tell the story all the time about how I believe God actually told me that I was going to marry my now wife.
Mm.
I rocked up at church. The first time I saw her, I heard this like voice. It was not coming from within me. It felt like it
Yeah.
was like a voice coming from outside of me, pretty much
Yep.
like pointing me to the lady that was playing cello on stage.
And
Thankfully,
you went and interrupted
yeah,
the music to just tell her that.
yeah. I
Yeah.
grabbed the cello and I said, "Hey, listen to me for a second."
Yeah. You're getting distracted.
Yeah,
Here I am.
yeah. To be honest, I am an extremely forward person, and it wasn't too far off what happened.
Great.
Um, the and
Good thing she wasn't on drums.
grab the sticks.
Yep.
And so and what made it even harder kind of think that it meant anything was we sort of got to know each other, and admittedly, I was, as I said, I was very forward and I was very upfront, and I just
Mm,
kind of said to her, I was like, "Hey, would you like to go grab tea sometime?" She
yeah.
wrote me a paragraph back saying no,
Explaining
and
why she enjoys coffee more. Is that what she was saying?
no, saying, "Hey, why'd you grab the cello out of my hands the other day?" No,
It
no,
really bothered me.
yeah, and no, she pretty much just was. She was very upfront with me, and she said, like, I'm not looking for a relationship at this point.
Mm,
I don't really know you well enough to say yes to that, and I was, and to be
sure.
honest, the really upfront response, I was like, wow, this is great. She's a very forward person. I like this.
Yeah.
And so yeah, there was that after that kind of rejection, I was like, oh, maybe I was dreaming. And then I
Mm,
went through like another rough period, and later on, I had another chance where I got close to her, and
mm.
I kind of tried to pull another move again and say, "Hey, would you like to look at our relationship a little more seriously?" And she said no again, and and then that was where I was at the point where I was like, "No, I like I'm dreaming at this point. Like I imagined
Mm,
that voice. I
mm.
imagined that voice. This is not true." And
Yep.
I was presented with a situation where I was like, "This is like hopeless in terms of what I thought was happening."
Yeah.
Thankfully, I never told anyone about this until we actually got married.
We
But
keep that under
then,
the rug.
yeah, but then it was like after a couple months, things just totally started to shift, and we ended up together.
Mm,
But it was one of those moments where I was like, if I didn't decide to test and follow up on that voice and test that spirit,
yep.
I may not have been married to the woman of my dreams by now.
That's right.
That may not have been a reality for me.
Yep.
Um, and there's so many other things that once you start to test those spirits appropriately, that just start to fall into place, and you go, yeah, now I can't, like you said, now I can't live without it. It's not a
Yep.
matter of can I live with it or can I choose to adopt it. It's now I can't live without it. This
That's
is
right.
how I'm meant to live.
Yep.
Yeah, and so I guess that sort of leads on to the next question that I was going to ask you, which is like, um, how vital do you think this message is that you're trying to send through this book? How vital do you think it is? And do you think we're really missing how vital this message is? Do you think we're
Mm.
totally like missing a beat here, and missing a massive crucial aspect of the faith potentially?
Yeah. The look amidst all of the realm stuff and the unseen stuff and the spiritual happenings that are throughout the book, the main message that I would hope to communicate is, and I think this is a message that has been done in multiple stories across the board, is the idea of who we are as sons of God, is the message of sonship and of redemption, and what it is to be a son, which I think is a really really important message, especially in today's day and age. Knowing your identity in Christ, knowing Christ in you, and the power that provides, but you know sometimes not even about the power, just about the internal understanding of I am loved by my heavenly Father, and I am adopted into His kingdom, and I have a seat of authority in Him because of Christ. And so, learning how to move in that authority, and learning how to be led by the Holy Spirit to move in those different realms and different aspects and different spheres of influence in the world. But in all things, being led by Christ, being led by God, first of all, and also, and this is one that I'm starting to look more deeply at, is doing it from a place of rest.
Yeah.
I think those are probably two key aspects: the sonship, the principle of sonship, and learning to do so from a place of rest, resting in God, and moving from that place. So I think those are two really really important principles for me, and for my understanding, and for where I'm at and where I'm heading.
Mm-mm. Yeah, the rest aspect I think is I
Mm,
think you've really touched on something super important there, right?
that's a big one.
The
That's a big one.
rest aspect is something that I think is going to be a bit of a trickier thing to
Yep.
for the world to come to terms with, because we live in this hustle society,
Hmm.
especially in first world countries. It's all about how do you increase the grind.
Oh
How do
yeah.
you increase the number in your bank account? How do you
Yep.
increase the image of success? And
Mm.
there's all of these markers that we have of what success looks like in this
Yes.
world, right?
Yes.
Success looks like lots of possessions.
Mm-hmm.
Success looks like a big number in your bank account.
Yep.
Success looks like a very toned, fit body.
Mm-hmm.
Success can look like being a charismatic speaker or making people laugh.
Yep.
Success
Yep.
can look like being notably talented or,
Mm.
being famous for some way, shape, or form. Success can
Yeah.
look like being powerful. There's all of these markers that we have of like, this is what success looked like. And
Yep.
almost none of those are synonymous. I'd say none of those are synonymous with rest, right?
No. No. No.
Um, None of them are synonymous with this idea of, whoa, slow down, don't
Mm.
do anything,
Yep.
just stop, soak in some time with the Lord. That's
Yep.
it.
Yep. And I think it's twofold. I think it's absolutely that. I think there's the element of the just stop and sit back and do nothing. Because again, I can speak from personal experience when there are days on the weekend or something like that where you go, I've got to tick this job off, then that, then that, then that, then that. Whether that's book related, whether that's household chores, whether that's prepping for your next week. There's just this mindset of if I've got time to sit down and do nothing, then I've got time to be doing something, and I've got to
Yeah,
keep working at that.
yeah,
So there, I think you're right. I think there's the taking the time to stop and rest in His presence and just be and do nothing and say nothing and just be with Him
yeah,
and enjoy the love that He wants to lavish out on you.
yeah,
But I also think there's an element of rest in the understanding of knowing who you are,
yeah,
because when you're in that place and when you understand who you are and when you act on His will and act on what He wants you to do, it's not a place of striving to do things to accomplish things. You know, you're acting in your authority as a king, you're acting in your authority as a son, and so the things that He calls you to do, there can be an element of ease to it
yeah,
because you're not fighting in this spiritual warfare aspect, or I've got to beat this demon or
yeah,
cast it out or whatever.
yeah,
You're just walking in an understanding of who you are,
yeah.
and it just makes things so much more simple
Mm-hmm.
and so much easier to do.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. There's when you understand who you are and you understand your
Mm.
creator, you
Yeah.
also understand the mind of the creator and the creation that you're living
Mm.
in, right?
Yep.
And there's this revelation that you continually kind of open yourself up to where the more you understand how the world works, the more you can actually kind of get real success, right?
Mm. Oh yeah.
There's a lot of times when I find myself praying for someone, for example,
Mm.
and there's almost like little cheat codes to
Yeah.
I guess there's almost like little cheat codes of like how the world actually works where if I want to get like a prophecy for someone or a word of wisdom for someone
Mm.
or even just try and communicate maybe what God wants to communicate to this person,
Yeah.
um I just position my heart in the most Christ-like way that I possibly can, which is
Yep.
I just say to myself, man, this person is amazing. This person that I'm praying for, they're incredible and they're
Yep.
loved and
Yep.
they have like an infinite value to them and God
Mm.
loves them so much and
Yep.
I'm going to do my best to love them as much as I can in this moment.
Yeah.
And with this kind of like recognition of who they are, I say to myself, God, what do you want to tell this person that you love a lot?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I find that like that's almost like a little cheat code for me to just like let the spirit flow in that moment. And I find that I get a lot of like spiritual interaction when things like that happen.
Mm.
And for other people, I know their cheat code is like they just go for a walk in like a park
Yep.
and they stop and they decide to just appreciate nature in front of them with the
Yes.
perspective of the creator. And then
Yep.
they just find themselves washed with the spirit in that moment. Like, and
It could
things
be
just kind of,
simple things.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yep.
And when you really understand how the world works and understand more of your creator,
Mm.
um, you almost find that your metric for success totally changes,
Yep.
totally dips, moves, and like all of these ideas of money, power, fame, success,
Yep.
according to the worldly, they just drop off. You don't care
Hmm.
for any of it anymore, right?
That's right. Yep.
You and I came from a school where there was probably a lot of wealthy people around us, and
Hmm. Yep.
you and I have had this conversation before where we didn't really grow up with many pennies to our name, if any at all.
No. No.
I
And yet, even sorry, even just to interrupt there,
yeah,
I can speak on my behalf. And yet, I came from a household of wealth, not
yeah,
necessarily financial wealth,
yeah, yeah,
but an understanding of I never went without. I had
yes,
parents who loved me, who
yep,
cherished me, who wanted the best for me.
yep,
Uh,
yeah,
so I just wanted to elaborate on the fact that
yeah,
even without the physical stuff, even without the financial stuff,
yeah,
there are just depths to wealth
yeah,
that you come to understand when you start to appreciate
exactly right.
the a different perspective on things.
Yeah, exactly right. And there's
You're talking success and stuff. That's you view it as this or as fame or as money, as fortune, and whatever it is.
mm,
But even switching the concept of wealth to a wealth of wisdom or a
yeah,
wealth of family,
yeah.
a wealth of love, it's just a whole different world.
Yeah, and you wouldn't have it any other way, right? Like there's no
Absolutely.
question.
Yep.
Like when I got married to my wife, I had like negative $250 in my bank account.
Yep.
And like being married was without question, like especially, learning marriage and moving in with the person that I love the most,
Mm.
it was one of the most joyful periods of my entire life. And
Yeah.
you could remove any amount of money and wealth that my wife and I have, and it would still
Yep.
be joyful and it would still
Yes.
be awesome because that
Absolutely.
that marker for success.
Almost.
Yeah,
There you go.
that marker for success. That marker for success for us has gone out the window. We don't care for it
Yep.
anymore. We care for the
That's
joys that we
right.
get in that
Yep.
in that union with one another.
Yep.
And those sorts of things are far more permanent,
Mm.
far more solid, far more foundational than.
Yeah. Far
Um,
richer.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There's so much
Yep.
more depth and so much more joy that you can retrieve from those things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I guess now that we're starting to speak about more of like a worldly concern,
Mm.
this is maybe the last major question I'm going to ask, but probably maybe potentially going to take us the longest to chat about.
Sure.
Is how do you go about communicating these ideas to someone who may not call themselves a believer,
Mm.
or maybe not even just a believer in the Christian God, but a believer in God entirely, right? Because
Yep.
um, for me, I really enjoyed a lot of the connections that you made in the book because, I'm fairly familiar with the Bible. I'd like to hope.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there was a lot of cool little like Easter eggs and references. Some a little more on the nose than others, and some a
Mm.
lot more subtle. That I
Yep.
I started to see a bunch of connections in there, and I was like, wow, this is cool. Like how Micah's weaving the biblical narrative into this in like larger ways and smaller ways.
Yeah.
But there's the concern of how do you even remotely communicate this to someone who has no frame of reference for God, or no, they don't care for it, or they don't believe
Yep.
in it or anything like that. Like where do you begin there?
Well, that was another part of writing it was, I guess, trying to communicate God in and amongst all these spiritual aspects into a medium that might reach people that weren't just Christians, that might extend into the world and find its way into the hands of people that wouldn't call themselves believers, and that it might awaken something in them as well, that it might present them with some sort of knowledge or some sort of insight into what it is to be a believer and what it is to know God. It's actually an interesting one. I did mull quite a bit over how much of God to put into the story.
Yeah.
Because, again, if I reference back to Tolkien's work in the movie, I haven't actually read the books. I know that's a bit controversial,
Yeah.
but in
Yeah.
in in the movies, which I thoroughly enjoy, there is no reference to a God character. even with all of the parallels to spirituality
Yeah.
and the supernatural. Even though there is a God character in his world, from what I
Yeah.
understand,
Yeah.
but for me there was a very deliberate choice to include God in the work, because I wanted to demonstrate him. I wanted to demonstrate his love and his nature toward these characters, towards his sons and daughters in the book,
Yeah.
in the story. I wanted to present that. So, like you said, there will be some glaringly obvious connections that can be made in the story. That was one aspect that I wanted to include in the book, and it's so that if it did reach the hands of people that weren't necessarily believers, they're probably going to know that it's a reference to God. But that, in one sense, it was part of the effort, was part of the intent, was to present him in a way that might reach people that aren't necessarily walking the walk that we are. Aside from that, I think the main way, for me at least at this present point, the main way for me to communicate God to anyone would be in simply mimicking him.
Yeah.
And in the largest possible sense, it would be demonstrating love. Not trying. Yeah, I think that's the simplest way that I could put it, would be just to show love to anyone and everyone, regardless of what it is you believe, regardless of where it is that you are in a spiritual journey, if you're even on one. I think just the best way to communicate God is to mimic him, to be like him.
Yeah.
And I think that's a form of worship to him as well, is when you model your life or choose to pursue a life that is pleasing to him. And so I think that would be the best way in my mind at the moment to communicate. A lot of the stuff would be to start from a place of love,
Yeah.
where the other person, the other group, the other people, that they know that you're coming at them from a position of understanding their value, understanding their worth, understanding their importance, um, and loving them in that
Yeah.
place.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. There's you know, the these sorts of things like books and podcasts and YouTube videos and whatever else that we put out there.
Mm,
You know, they're helpful tools,
yep.
and they're useful, and you know, we always pray that our content maybe even saves souls. That would be, you
Yeah.
know, that would be a wonderful thing.
Mm,
But it would certainly be foolish to assume that the content itself could do the work that we're meant to do personally, right?
sure. Mm,
And um, there's a really difficult conundrum where
mm,
you have to understand that, like, and I always find myself going through these motions all the time whenever I post a new episode, is that um you know, our content that we put out there, it may only reach one person ever, right?
right. That's
it
right.
may only it may only reach one person ever. You know, C.S. Lewis,
Mm,
a classic example. He always spoke about how his books, he's like, oh, I know this will be forgotten. You know,
yeah.
like, as his life was coming to an end,
Mm,
he would talk about how he'd say he would be stoked if even one person picked up his books or
yep.
took his messages seriously, and
Yep.
it's probably the most famous Christian literature ever, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Mind
exactly.
blowing stuff.
Yeah.
But the expectation is all the same for us. We're just like, man, if even one person comes to Christ from the effort that we put in, how wonderful would that be,
It's
right?
all worth it. That
Yeah,
makes it all worth it. Yep.
and I think it makes it so much easier for you to not be so concerned about, like, how do I reach the masses, right?
Mm,
I think there's a trap of saying to yourself, how do I reach the masses? How do I reach
yeah.
everyone? How does every ear hear this message or hear this problem?
Mm,
Um, Rather than simply saying, hey, if just one person benefits off this,
that's right.
then your expectation is, like, if that one person happens, or, you know,
Yep.
if you get to heaven and that one person comes up and has a chat to you, then everything would be worth it in the end, right?
It's all worth it. That's exactly right. Yep.
Yeah. And it also means it's far more humbling when there's two people that
That's right.
you
Yeah,
know.
exactly right. Yeah, yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's very humbling when you get that second person that says, "Hey, man, I love the book." You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's yeah, it's
Mm.
Do you find that C.S. Lewis was a huge motivator for you to finish, or do you find that there was someone else that was a huge motivator for you to kind of like really put pen to paper, or
Not particularly, if I'm perfectly honest with you.
yeah,
We've talked about it before. Again, I know it's controversial, but I'm not a
yeah,
huge reader, to
yeah,
be perfectly honest.
neither am I. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So it's a bit of a funny one when you tell people you've written a book when you're not a huge reader.
yeah,
Uh, no, I couldn't say that there was particularly anything that drove me toward finishing.
yeah,
It was purely this. This is what I want to do,
yeah,
and it was just one step at a time. It was quite literally one weekend at a time.
yeah,
I
yeah,
would go back to work, come back home, and I'd be okay. This weekend we're doing this. Then it would be next weekend we're doing that. We're doing this chapter. We're doing that chapter. We're editing this chapter. We're going to edit that. But it really did feel like a bit of a slog at times.
yeah,
But that was my motivation. Was God cheering me on, helping me through the way.
mm,
Um, yeah,
yeah,
there wasn't a particular figure that drove me toward finishing. It was just this was what I wanted to do.
yeah. There's it's almost quite reassuring, right, to know that maybe people who aren't big readers might pick
Mm.
up the book, or for me, it's
Yeah.
like people who don't listen to podcasts might
Mm.
have a listen to one of the episodes.
Yeah.
Because if you think about, like to circle back to the idea of someone, maybe not appreciating or not believing in God or appreciating any of the ideas behind the Bible,
Yeah.
there's there's probably way more stories that we could ever imagine of people who were just like, I don't read very often, but I picked up the Bible one day, or
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't listen to podcasts very often, but I decided to listen to this one,
Yeah.
or I don't watch TV shows very often, but there was this chosen series, or
Mm.
my friend had the Passion of the Christ playing in the background while I was at his house, and
Yep.
and I decided to watch the last 15 minutes of it with him or something. And
Yep.
it's very reassuring that you don't have to have a whole bunch of credentials to just get something out there and to
Yeah.
um to put pen to paper or to start recording anything.
Mm.
As long as you're
Exactly.
faithfully putting forward what God has asked you to put forward, then you
Yep.
don't need those credentials behind you.
No.
Yeah, it's awesome to see that as well. Now we have this internet age to allow us to be able to do this sort of thing so easily, right?
Mm. Yep.
There's a whole, it was so easy for me to grab your book, a couple of taps on my phone, and
Done.
5 minutes later it was there and I was reading it. And
Yep.
it's the same if people want to listen to podcasts or watch YouTube videos or what
Hmm.
have you. It's all there for us to start doing. So
That's right.
it's awesome now that because you and I have known each other since high school. We know that
Mm.
back in high school I wouldn't have gone up to you and said, Micah, you're going to write a book one day. And
Yeah. Oh,
I
you're
know,
gonna do a podcast.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You and I were those dudes who were just like nerds talking about the cartoons that we would watch as kids.
Oh yeah.
And now we're both here in 2024 putting out biblical
Mm.
content to the best of
Yep.
our abilities. And
That's right. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
I think I hope that whatever we do serves as a motivation for those people who are yet to put pen to paper or yet to turn on that microphone. It's
Exactly right. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. As I'm sure is a similar hope for you. Like when you asked me that question of what are you hoping to achieve with the book, I'm sure you've got a similar mindset with what you're doing.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Mm.
There's the thankfully I've already had a few people come up to me and said, hey, I never knew about that perspective on this topic. Thank you for
Yeah.
inviting that person on. They had a wealth of wisdom to offer. And you go, wow,
Yep.
finally, you know,
Exactly. Yeah.
finally someone can hear what I've been hearing now that,
Yeah.
I've been friends with this person or whatever. And yeah,
Mm.
I hope that, um, that at the very least we inspire other Christians to do what we're doing. If we're not
Yeah.
inspiring the people who aren't Christian, we're inspiring the ones who are
That's right. Yeah.
to inspire the ones who aren't Christian,
Mm.
Um,
The one
yeah,
person sows, another reaps.
yeah,
You know.
exactly
Yep.
right, exactly right.
Mm.
Well, that has very neatly flown by.
That's it.
Yeah, we've already hit an hour.
Oh, righto.
Yeah,
Kitty aunt.
that's that's flown by. I think as
Mm.
a lot of our conversations have in the past.
Yes.
So before I let you go,
Mm.
Kindred of the Unseen
Yes.
by Micah Beardsley. Where do people
Yeah.
get it?
Yep.
Where do people, if someone wants to get a hold of this book, where do people go to get it?
The main source would be Amazon, as
Uh-huh.
obviously. They can also visit my website, which is just my name, micahbeardsley.com, and you can pick up the ebook on my website. But those are the main two sources at the moment.
Terrific. I will have those links in the descriptions of my videos. If anybody wants to grab a copy of Kindred of the Unseen, please go click those links and support Micah. But
Thank you.
thanks so much for coming on, man. I really appreciate you donating your time to have a chat with me about this topic.
It's been my pleasure.
Yeah,
My
and
pleasure anytime.
cheers to us maybe getting fan number 2 saying that they appreciate the book, right?
One step at a time.
Yeah, exactly right. Awesome. All right. Thanks for that, mate. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure. So good to see you, man.